Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to talk about literally the most complex, fascinating structure in the known universe. I'm talking about the human nervous system. You can really think of it as the body's ultimate biological computer network. It is the absolute master communication and control system of your entire body. I mean, every single thing you do, feel, and think relies on this network constantly taking in data from inside and outside your body, processing it in mere fractions of a second, and then coordinating the exact right response. So we're going to break down exactly how this incredible machinery works, and just as importantly, how medical professionals assess it when things go wrong. But right off the bat, I want you to think about this high-stakes question. What happens when the body's ultimate communication network crashes? When a biological system this intricate experiences trauma or disease, the results can be, well, catastrophic. The signals drop. The body goes into a full-blown state of emergency. So to truly understand how clinicians troubleshoot these life or death system failures, we first need to understand the normal, healthy architecture of the network itself. All right, so let's start with Section 1, the master control system, the hardware of the human body. To keep you functioning and maintain that vital homeostasis, our nervous system performs three key jobs: sensory input, integration, and motor output. And to actually pull this off, the physical hardware is split into two main divisions. On one side, we have the central nervous system, or CNS. This is your body's main processor, made up of the brain and the spinal cord. It receives the data, processes it, and basically figures out what to do next. On the other side, we have the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. Think of these as the physical cables, the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and all the peripheral nerves branching out to your fingertips and toes. The really crucial thing to remember here is that the PNS is strictly a courier system. It carries sensory information to the central processor, and then it carries motor instructions back out to the rest of the body. Let's pop open the hood and look at the brain to see how this builds our central processor. The brain is securely protected by a rigid skull, and it's divided into some highly specialized hardware regions. You have the cerebrum. That's the largest part you usually picture, responsible for conscious thought, memory, and voluntary movement. Deep inside that is the diencephalon, which houses the thalamus for sensory relay, and the hypothalamus, which keeps your internal environment stable by regulating things like body temperature. Tucked in the back is the cerebellum, keeping your movements perfectly coordinated. But I want you to pay special attention to the brainstem. The brainstem connects the brain down to the spinal cord, and it is absolutely vital for your survival. It runs your most essential automatic functions in the background. We're talking breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. And this brilliantly illustrates how the motor side of our peripheral nervous system manages those involuntary functions. We call this the autonomic nervous system, and it has two brilliant, entirely opposing divisions. First up, you have the sympathetic division. This preps your body for activity or stress. It's your classic fight-or-flight mode. Your heart rate shoots up, your pupils dilate to let in more light, and digestion just hits pause. In contrast to that, the parasympathetic division supports normal maintenance and energy conservation. This is your rest and digest mode, bringing your heart rate back down and kicking your digestion back into gear. They work dynamically together, constantly tweaking things across your organs to keep you perfectly balanced. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 2, cells, signals, and synapses, the biological software. To really understand how data travels through all this hardware, we have to zoom way, way into the microscopic level. Specifically, we're looking at specialized cells called neurons. Now, before a neuron even fires a signal, it sits at this highly specific number, -70 millivolts. That is its resting membrane potential. When a neuron isn't actively transmitting a signal, the inside of the cell maintains a negative electrical charge compared to the outside. It manages this delicate balancing act using selective permeability and sodium-potassium pumps. But here's the thing. At -70 millivolts, the neuron isn't just taking a nap. It is eagerly primed, fully charged, and just waiting for a stimulus so it can fire. When a strong enough stimulus finally arrives, boom, we get an action potential. It's a rapid, highly localized change in electrical charge. First comes depolarization. Voltage-gated sodium channels suddenly fly open, and positive sodium ions just rush into the cell. The inside of the neuron rapidly becomes more positive. Second is repolarization. Those sodium channels shut down and potassium channels open up, letting positive potassium ions rush out, which brings the inside back down to a negative state. Finally, the neuron completely returns to its resting state, so it can fire all over again. And what's really incredible here is the sheer speed of this. Thanks to a fatty insulation wrapped around the axon called myelin, the electrical signal can literally jump down the nerve in a lightning-fast process called saltatory conduction. But what happens when that electrical signal hits the very end of the neuron? It hits a roadblock, a tiny gap called a synapse. To actually cross this physical gap, the electrical signal has to convert itself into a chemical packet. So when the action potential arrives at the terminal, calcium channels open up, letting calcium flow in. This triggers the release of chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters, things you've probably heard of like dopamine, glutamate, or GABA. These neurotransmitters float across the gap, which is called the synaptic cleft, and bind to specific receptors on the next cell, telling it exactly how to respond. It's just this incredibly elegant transition from an electrical spark to a chemical messenger. So we've established just how brilliant this system is, right? The lightning-fast electrical impulses, the chemical transmitters, the highly specialized brain regions. But that brings us to a really practical, real-world question. So how do we know when this complex network is failing? I mean, if the central processor or the peripheral cables get damaged, what does that actually look like when you're standing next to a patient's bed? Which leads us to Section 3, Neurological Assessment in Action, Troubleshooting the Network. When a patient arrives with a potential brain injury or illness, medical professionals don't just guess what's going on. They use a very precise diagnostic toolkit, a neurological assessment, to spot clinical changes in the brain, spinal cord, or peripheral function. And the absolute most critical number in evaluating that patient is 15. This is the maximum, the best possible total score you can get on the Glasgow Coma Scale, or the GCS. A score of 15 means the patient is demonstrating optimal consciousness across all of the required tests. But how exactly do clinicians arrive at this magic number? Well, the GCS breaks consciousness down into 3 core components: eye-opening, verbal response, and motor response. By scoring these individual components separately, clinicians can track exact neurological function. Now, a really crucial takeaway for you here is that you shouldn't just look at the total number out of 15. The individual component scores provide far more vital clinical information than the total alone. Why? Because they tell you exactly which part of the network is responding and which part isn't. If you take a look at how these scores are actually mapped out, for eye-opening, the maximum score is 4 if the patient opens their eyes spontaneously, all the way down to a 1 for absolutely no response. For verbal, a fully oriented talking patient gets a 5, while someone who makes no sound gets a 1. And for motor response, the top score is a 6 if they can successfully obey commands. Lower motor scores map to specific automatic reflexes. For instance, an abnormal flexion response scores a 3, an abnormal extension scores a 2. Documenting these specific responses allows the medical team to rapidly detect if a patient's brain function is starting to deteriorate. Another vital piece of this bedside assessment is the pupillary response, which cleverly tests 2 specific cranial nerves at once. The optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, acts as the sensory cable. It detects the light shining into the eye and sends that sensory data back to the brain. Then, the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, acts as the motor cable, carrying the instruction back out to the eye to constrict the pupil. In a healthy, functioning system, shining a light in one eye causes a direct light response, meaning that pupil constricts, and a consensual light response, meaning the opposite pupil constricts at the exact same time. If a clinician suddenly sees a new unilaterally fixed and dilated pupil, meaning one pupil is large and not reacting to light, this is a massive red flag. It can indicate dangerous compression of cranial nerve 3 and possible brain herniation that requires urgent, immediate escalation. To evaluate the motor pathways carrying instructions all the way from the brain down the spinal cord to the muscles, clinicians use the Medical Research Council Muscle Strength Scale. A top grade of 5 means the patient has normal power against gravity and full resistance from the clinician. A grade of 3 means the patient can lift their arm or leg against gravity, but not if the clinician applies any resistance. And a 0 means absolutely no detectable muscle contraction at all. Clinicians carefully compare the left and right sides of the body here. Any sudden weakness, particularly if it's just affecting one side of the body, is a massive warning sign of an acute neurological problem. Moving on to our final segment, Section 4. System failures and dysfunctions, when the network goes down. So what are the specific pathologies that actually cause these massive disruptions in our biological software and hardware? There are several really common culprits that can crash the system. First up are strokes. These happen when the blood supply to a part of the brain is interrupted, either an ischemic stroke from a clot or blockage or a hemorrhagic stroke from active bleeding. Next, you have head injuries, causing direct physical trauma, swelling, or internal bleeding. Then we have severe infections like meningitis or encephalitis. And finally, there are the slower, progressive threats to the network. Degenerative conditions like Parkinson's disease cause a slow, progressive loss of dopamine-producing neurons. And demyelinating conditions like multiple sclerosis happen when the body's own immune system actually attacks and damages that fatty myelin insulation we talked about in the CNS, which severely disrupts the normal transmission of nerve impulses. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it explains the sheer physics behind brain injuries. It's called the Monro-Kelly principle. Remember, the brain sits inside a rigid, unforgiving bone box, your skull. Inside this box, there is only room for exactly three things: brain tissue, blood, and cerebrospinal fluid. Because the adult skull literally cannot expand, an increase in the volume of any one of these components, say from bleeding or swelling after a hit to the head, must initially be compensated for by a decrease in one of the other two. But if that compensation fails, intracranial pressure, or ICP, rapidly increases. This is incredibly dangerous because it cuts off fresh blood flow and can literally physically crush brain tissue. And if that intracranial pressure continues to rise completely unchecked, it triggers a catastrophic late-stage emergency warning known as Cushing's triad. You'll see three very distinct vital sign changes. First, hypertension, specifically with a widening pulse pressure. Second, bradycardia, which is an abnormally slowed down heart rate. And third, irregular respirations. If a clinician sees Cushing's triad, it means the brain's compensation mechanisms have totally failed, those vital brainstem functions are actively being compromised, and brain herniation may be imminent. It is literally the ultimate SOS from the nervous system. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. The nervous system is just a beautiful, intricate machine, constantly processing sensory inputs, generating complex thoughts, and firing electrical impulses at breakneck speeds just to keep us alive and functioning. But, as we've seen, it is also vulnerable. Understanding normal neuroanatomy isn't just about memorizing brain regions or action potentials for a test. It provides the absolute fundamental baseline you need to recognize when things go terribly wrong. So I'll leave you with this final thought. When the body's communication network sends out an SOS, will you know how to read the signals? Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep learning. Hey everyone.